We will now look at how matter moves through ecosystems. A biogeochemical cycle shows the movement of matter within and between ecosystems. It is a natural pathway by which essential elements of living matter are circulated. Four cycles we will study are the hydrologic cycle, also called the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. We begin with the carbon cycle. In the diagram, we see carbon in the form of CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and organic carbon in living things. There are many processes that exchange carbon in nature. The carbon cycle describes the movement of carbon in the form of atoms and molecules between sources and sinks. A source is a process that produces carbon-containing compounds. A sink is a reservoir that stores carbon-containing compounds. Two processes involving carbon-containing compounds in living things are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Plant and animal decomposition have led to the storage of carbon over millions of years, some in the form of fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels quickly moves stored carbon into atmospheric carbon as carbon dioxide. This diagram shows the carbon cycle in terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. Photosynthesis is the process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it as organic compounds in the biomass of producers. Respiration is the process of reacting organic compounds to produce energy and releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. All living organisms respire, including plants, animals, and microbes. As decomposers work to break down dead organisms, they respire, releasing CO2 as well. When fossil fuels are burned in factories and cars, CO2 is released into the atmosphere. Major reservoirs or storage areas, sinks, of carbon are the oceans in the form of sediments, the biosphere in the form of organic compounds in organisms, and the atmosphere in the form of CO2, carbon dioxide gas. The main impact on the carbon cycle by humans is increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When fossil fuels are burned, CO2 is released directly into the atmosphere, thereby increasing its concentration. When forests are clear-cut, CO2 remains in the atmosphere because the trees that act as carbon sinks are removed. This reduces photosynthesis, resulting in less CO2 being removed from the atmosphere. This graph shows how CO2 concentration has changed as measured at Mauna Loa, Hawaii. The red line shows that CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is steadily increasing over time. The gray line represents annual fluctuations. Look at the insert box that represents an annual cycle of CO2 concentration. Notice that it increases in the spring and summer when the rate of photosynthesis is higher and decreases in fall and winter when the rate of photosynthesis is lower. The next biogeochemical cycle is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle shows the movement of nitrogen atoms and molecules between sources and sinks. In this cycle, the reservoirs store nitrogen compounds for relatively short periods of time. The major reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. In the diagram, we see several forms of nitrogen, including N2 gas, which is atmospheric nitrogen gas, NH3, which is ammonia, NH4 plus 1, which is ammonium, NO2 negative 1, which is nitrite, and NO3 negative 1, which is nitrates. Notice the locations of the substances. N2 is in the atmosphere, while ammonia, ammonium, nitrite, and nitrate are in the soil. Let's look more closely at the processes involved in the nitrogen cycle. It is important to note that bacteria play major roles in the nitrogen cycle. They are involved in all conversions. Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of N2 gas molecules into NH3 and NH4+. Organisms that carry out this process are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria form symbiotic relationships with many plants. In the legume family of plants, which are beans and peas, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are located in root nodules. They receive food from plant roots and provide the plant with a usable source of nitrogen. Nitrogen fixation is accomplished in water by cyanobacteria activity and may also occur in the atmosphere when lightning triggers the reaction to occur. Ammonification is the process in which organic compounds are converted into ammonium, NH4+, and then into nitrites, NO2-, after organisms die. It is carried out by microorganisms and results in making nitrogen available for use by other organisms. Nitrification is the conversion of nitrites into nitrates. It requires oxygen, so it occurs in circulating or flowing water and in surface layers of soil. Again, this process is facilitated by bacteria. Assimilation is the process by which plants and animals incorporate the nitrates, NO3-, and ammonia into plant proteins and nucleic acids. Denitrification is the conversion of nitrate, NO3-, into N2 gas by denitrifying bacteria. The N2 gas is then released back into the atmosphere and the cycle continues. Denitrification is the only nitrogen transformation that removes nitrogen from ecosystems. Humans can impact the nitrogen cycle in several ways. Excess nitrates are introduced into ecosystems through the use of fertilizers. Since nitrates can dissolve in water, the excess can get into water bodies through runoff caused by irrigation. This can then lead to eutrophication, which leads to hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels in the water, resulting in death to aquatic organisms. Burning fossil fuels also introduces nitrogen into ecosystems in the form of nitrogen oxides. This can lead to smog and acid rain. The next biogeochemical cycle is the phosphorus cycle. It shows the movement of phosphorus around the biosphere. Major reservoirs of phosphorus are rocks and sediments. One unique characteristic of this cycle is that there is no atmospheric component. In other words, there is no gaseous form. Phosphorus is a limiting factor in ecosystems because it is scarce. Let's look at this diagram of the phosphorus cycle and begin on the right side with the rabbit. Phosphorus is found in organic compounds as phosphate, PO4-3. These organic compounds in the biomass of living things become decomposed once the organism dies. The decomposition releases the phosphates into soil, where it can become incorporated into living things, or it can get into water bodies. In water bodies, over long periods of time, it is precipitated as solids, as rocks. The rocks are uplifted, again, over very long periods of time, and exposed to the atmosphere, where they are weathered. This weathering process releases phosphates into soil and water. Here is another diagram showing the phosphorus cycle. Follow through this one and compare to the previous diagram. Again, notice there is no atmospheric component. One way humans impact the phosphorus cycle is by adding phosphorus to ecosystems through phosphate runoff. Phosphates can get into the environment through fertilizers and household detergents. Another way humans interfere with the natural phosphorus cycle is by mining phosphate rocks. Instead of allowing the rocks to become exposed to the surface by the natural process of uplifting, we dig into the earth and bring them up faster. The last biogeochemical cycle we study is the hydrologic cycle, also called the water cycle. It describes the movement of water through its various states of matter. The oceans are the primary reservoir of water at the Earth's surface, with groundwater and ice caps being smaller reservoirs. In this water cycle diagram, we can see the many ways water moves through the biosphere. Water evaporates from water bodies, then condenses and falls back to Earth as precipitation. Plants transpire water into the atmosphere and absorb it through their roots. Snow melts, which runs into streams. Surface runoff also goes into streams. Streams and rivers ultimately flow into oceans. Water infiltrates the ground and accumulates in groundwater. This more simplified diagram shows the basic processes of evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and collection. Evaporation is the conversion of liquid water to water vapor. Condensation is the conversion of water vapor to liquid water. Precipitation is liquid water in the form of clouds being released as rain or snow. Transpiration is the release of water from leaves during photosynthesis. In the diagram of the plant, we can see how water moves through a plant body. Water enters the plant through the roots and is pulled through the body, and eventually some of it will evaporate out of the leaves. The term evapotranspiration is used to refer to the combined processes of evaporation and transpiration. Humans may impact the natural water cycle in several ways. Withdrawal of groundwater can disrupt the water cycle. Paving over natural areas reduces infiltration and can lead to increased chances of flooding. Deforestation can disrupt the water cycle by reducing the amount of water returned to the atmosphere by transpiration. This graph shows how the depth to water below the ground surface has changed from 1960 to 2010. The depth of the well has increased because less groundwater is available. The Ogallala Aquifer is one of the largest sources of fresh groundwater in the United States. This graph shows that the depth of water in the Ogallala Aquifer has declined 19 feet from January 2001 until January 2017. So to summarize, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water are constantly cycled and recycled in ecosystems, and humans can affect and even alter these natural cycles.